I pin upon the map the most chilling and terrifying stories I have ever heard. In this story, one poor woman found herself having her husband replaced after a trip to Cambodia with something completely different and frightening. Share in the comments the horror legends from your city, and I will transform them into haunting and grim stories, utilizing all my writing prowess and talent. The phone rang in the dead of night, pulling me out of sleep. Half conscious, I instinctively reached for the receiver, not yet fully grasping what was happening. The voice on the other end barely penetrated the fog of my drowsiness, like something far away. The sheriff informed me that my husband's body had been taken to the morgue and that I needed to come in for identification. Cold sweat immediately broke out across my skin, and a strange, oppressive premonition stirred inside me. After all, my husband was right here, lying beside me, and I knew it with absolute certainty. I lowered the phone and glanced over my shoulder. Michael lay beside me, breathing softly in his sleep. I asked the sheriff, an old friend from school, if he was sure he hadn't made a mistake. He replied, "Listen, Jesse, I've known you and your husband since high school. I'm telling you straight. It's him, and he's dead. I'm sorry for your loss." Suddenly, in the darkness, I heard a rustling. My husband Michael was awake. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at me with a strange expression. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural coldness, and I felt a faint, unfamiliar fear creeping in. He asked what was going on, and gathering my strength, I quickly lied that my mother wasn't feeling well and that I needed to go. His gaze seemed empty, as if he didn't fully understand what I was saying. But he didn't object, just sat there, watching as I scrambled to gather my things. There was something unsettling, something indecipherable in that silence. It made me move faster. I ran into the night, the cool air instantly chilling my flushed face, and rushed to the car. I started the engine, pulled out of the garage, and picked up speed, ready to hit the road. But something made me stop for a moment and look back at our dark house standing in the shadows, casting a dark silhouette in the moonlight. And then I saw him. Michael was standing by the bedroom window, motionless, like a statue. His figure stood unnaturally straight, shoulders slightly hunched forward as if leaning closer to get a better look at me. He didn't blink, didn't move. A shiver ran through me, a feeling that this gaze wasn't my husband's, that something else entirely was watching me. The drive to the morgue passed in a blur, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts, a tangled ball of heavy fear and uncertainty coiling within me. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my fingers numb from tension, but I couldn't allow myself to relax. "It's a mistake," I kept repeating to myself, trying to drown out the cold voice of doubt. Michael's home. I saw him. I spoke to him. This can't be real. Yet somehow, I kept driving forward, as if caught in a nightmare that wouldn't end until I confronted this brutal reality. When I entered the morgue, everything seemed cloaked in cold fog, despite the sterile cleanliness of the room. The air was heavy, with a metallic tang that clung immediately to my throat. Only the quiet click of locks and the creak of metal wheels on the gurney holding the body disturbed the eerie silence. Sheriff James gave me a brief look, as though assessing me, but I felt lost in the cold darkness, clinging to the hope that this was just some terrible mistake. When the sheet was pulled back, I froze, seeing Michael. The body lying before me was horribly mutilated. Deep marks of violence marred his skin, and only a shadow of familiar features remained on his face. My fingers began to tremble. My breath quickened, as I realized with horror that it was indeed him. And yet it wasn't. The sheriff kept saying something, firmly repeating that it was definitely Michael, but his words just crashed against the wall of my terror. I desperately tried to deny it, unable to believe it. He was at home last night. I felt him beside me, saw his face, spoke with him. Panic overwhelmed me. I took a few steps back, feeling the world blur around me. This can't be true. My Michael is home. This is some kind of mistake, a horrible joke, or just a coincidence, I tried to convince myself. I pulled out my phone and showed the sheriff a picture of Michael and me, taken just last night. I looked at him intently, as though willing him to share my belief that this was simply an error. The sheriff looked at the image with deep surprise. He frowned, silently examining the photo, then looked back at the body. For the first time, there was something like doubt in his eyes, as if part of his mind refused to accept the obvious. "This man has been dead for at least 3 days," he said quietly, though the barely perceptible tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. We both stood there, in that cold, damp room, silently trying to comprehend the impossible. After a long pause, we began searching for any logical explanation. It seemed we were ready to cling to even the most absurd possibilities. Maybe it was Michael's brother, someone who looked like him, someone who came looking for my husband and met a mysterious end. Maybe it was just a case of mistaken identity. But all of it felt far-fetched and almost senseless. I asked about a DNA test, hoping it would dispel all doubts, to determine who this person truly was. The sheriff shrugged and said they'd need a sample for comparison. Driving home, a tightening unease wrapped around my throat. Mechanically, I steered the car, my eyes fixed on the road, though my thoughts were already drifting back, searching for anything I might have missed before. All those events, Michael's trip to Cambodia, his strange stories upon return, those inexplicable glances and cuts on his body, they now resurfaced in a different light, as if I were only now beginning to grasp their significance. And as I turned onto our driveway, slowing the car, a sudden clarity washed over me. This wasn't just coincidence. Somewhere deep within, a quiet horror had been lying in wait, growing with each step toward the door. How had this all started? It had all begun with an illness that slowly took Michael from me, right before my eyes. Pulmonary fibrosis, a diagnosis that sounded like a sentence, began draining his life force day by day. We knew his chances were slim, but clinging to hope, we threw ourselves into a hopeless fight. Each visit to the doctors brought darker news, endless tests, examinations that left us drained of even the faintest glimmer of optimism. Michael mustered strength for each new procedure, and I stayed by his side, though in my heart, I understood that the illness was pulling us into a dark abyss. We desperately sought a cure, even turning to unconventional methods, homeopathy, healing herbs, ancient remedies, strange rituals, anything to hold on to. But none of it brought any relief, just as the medical treatments hadn't. I watched as each month weakened Michael more, as the light in his eyes dimmed. He accepted the irreversibility of the illness, and I too could barely hold back that bitter realization within myself. Just when we had nearly lost all hope, something strange happened. One evening, as we sat in silence, drained from yet another futile treatment, Michael stumbled upon an article online. It spoke of an ancient healing lake deep in Cambodia. According to legend, this place had miraculous powers, able to heal even those who had lost their last hope. It sounded like another tale for those desperate enough to grasp at any chance. But when Michael spoke of this lake, I saw a spark ignite in his eyes. He spoke with such desperation, and yet with such hope, that I could hardly bring myself to refuse him. "Maybe this is the last chance," he whispered, barely waiting for my response. We argued for a long time. I didn't want him going alone, tried to convince him I needed to be there. But Michael resisted, saying Cambodia was dangerous and he didn't want me to risk it. He looked at me with a quiet sadness, and I realized he felt this was a personal battle, one he needed to face on his own. Michael set out almost immediately after we made the final decision. His figure, slightly stooped from fatigue, faded into the crowd at the station, and a feeling I couldn't explain arose within me. A strange, dreadful premonition, as if I were seeing him for the last time. I tried to shake off these thoughts, forced myself to stay calm, and at first, it even worked. Michael called whenever he could, telling me about the local scenery and people, sounding more collected than he had in months. Then one day, he simply vanished. At first, I thought he had lost access to communication, but hours turned into days, and my unease grew. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Everything fell apart, with troubling thoughts ringing in my mind. I repeatedly called his phone, sent emails, tried to contact local hotels to leave a message somewhere, but it was all in vain. Each day the despair grew, and finally I decided I would have to go to Cambodia to find him. Just as I began planning the trip, I received a message from Michael. A brief call from an unknown number. His voice sounded as if from another world, slightly muffled and different than usual. But he said he would be home soon. My anxiety eased a bit, my heart filled with relief. He was coming back. He was alive. I could breathe again. I could finally relax. I was preparing to meet Michael at the airport, feeling both eager and anxious. Finally, I would see him again after this long, dangerous journey. But somehow, unexpectedly, he appeared at the doorstep on his own, without even letting me know. When I opened the door and saw him, I was frozen in place. I stared at his familiar features, which now looked entirely different. Michael, who had once been so frail and exhausted, stood before me, radiating health. His eyes sparkled. His face shone with a smile I hadn't seen in ages. His skin, once pale and drained, now had a fresh tone with a healthy flush. Unable to restrain myself, I rushed to him, hugging him, as if afraid he would disappear. Finally, all of it, the weight of illness, despair, and loneliness, would stay in the past. I inhaled his scent, felt the warmth of his body, no longer weak and cold, and my heart filled with relief. He was back, and most importantly, he was healthy. That evening, like old times, we settled on the couch in front of the TV, immersed in a quiet, peaceful space that breathed safety. Only the soft lights glowed in the corners of the room, creating a cozy half-light. I thought about his journey and how he had found this miraculous healing. I wanted to know more, to understand how it had all happened, as if that could lift the last traces of my anxiety. I asked him how the healing went and what he had seen there. For a moment, something changed in his gaze. A flash of something cold and foreign flickered in his eyes. In that second, he seemed like a complete stranger to me. His eyes suddenly cooled, and his features took on a distant, almost harsh expression. It happened so quickly that I didn't have time to say anything, but it had definitely happened. Michael quickly returned to his usual self, apologized, visibly flustered, and explained that he didn't want to talk about it right now because he was too tired, His voice was soft, but I couldn't shake the thought of what I had just seen. The next day, Michael and I decided to go for a walk. I remember holding my breath as he took the first step outside, unable to shake the feeling that this day was a real celebration. We walked down the street, hand in hand, and I noticed the looks from our neighbors, who seemed just as surprised as I was. They stopped us, genuinely astonished, congratulating Michael on his recovery, their faces brimming with joyful amazement. It was like a dream, one that even I couldn't fully believe in yet. But I couldn't help feeling overjoyed. The meeting with the doctor only reinforced this feeling. He studied Michael for a long time, carefully checked his breathing, took his pulse, and finally admitted that it was a genuine miracle. I heard that word, and I felt not only hope, but a true belief awaken in me that we had indeed beaten the illness. When Michael and I walked back to our house after the doctor's visit, I saw Mrs. Dale with her dog. That old Labrador had always been friendly and loved when we gave him treats, so I happily stopped, reaching for a snack. But this time, something was different. The dog froze, rooted in place, and stared at Michael intently. There was something different in its gaze, a mix of fear and aggression that I had never seen before. The moment Michael took a step closer, the dog began to growl, then bark wildly, its body trembling with tension. Mrs. Dale, flustered, tried to calm it, pulling it back on the leash, but the dog wouldn't stop, staring straight at my husband as if it saw a threat. The thought that even an animal sensed something different, something invisible to me, haunted me as we returned home. And as I was preparing dinner, Michael suddenly went into the living room. A few minutes later, I decided to check on him, expecting to find him dozing off in front of the TV. He looked so exhausted after that long journey. But when I peeked into the room, I froze in surprise. He was sitting in the armchair opposite the TV, motionless, like a statue. The screen was on, but Michael didn't even seem to see what was on it. His gaze was cold and empty, fixed on the screen, yet he seemed to be looking right through it. A slight chill of fear ran through me, though I couldn't explain why. What's wrong with him? I thought, standing frozen in the doorway. There was something in that look, not just detached, but unusually indifferent, almost foreign. This was my Michael, yet at the same time, it felt like something else was inside him, something that had peered into his body and stayed there. But when he noticed me standing in the doorway, his gaze softened. He blinked, as if waking from a deep sleep, and smiled at me as he always did. I tried to smile back, but a trace of unease remained in me. That same cold foreboding that I had felt more than once since his return. That night, I awoke as if some distant sound had pulled me from a deep sleep. The room was thick with darkness, only pale moonlight seeping through the open window, casting thin, silvery streaks across the floor and walls. My hand reached out to the empty space beside me. Michael was gone. At that moment, my heart clenched, and my thoughts scattered in a chaotic rush, sorting through the possible reasons for why he might have gone out in the middle of the night. I held my breath, listening to the sounds outside. Something was off. I could feel it on an instinctual level. Through the open window, I heard heavy, muffled footsteps. They seemed to come closer and fade away simultaneously, like someone was walking slowly around the house. Then came a soft creak, like the wooden garage door swaying in the wind. But there was no wind. My usually quiet, cozy home now felt filled with an invisible threat. seeping into every corner, every shadow. Carefully stepping on the cool floor, I silently slipped out of bed, gripping the doorknob in hesitation before finally stepping out. In the dim light of the hallway, I saw his figure standing at the bedroom door. Michael seemed different than usual. His hair was slightly damp, and there was a faint smell of soap, as if he'd just stepped out of the shower. But what caught my eye were the strange details: fresh dirt streaks on his pajama pants, mixed with clumps of grass. They clung to the fabric in dark patches, and the sight of them sent a strange heaviness into my heart. Michael calmly explained that he'd heard strange noises outside the window and decided to check if everything was all right. Finding nothing, he had come back and decided to freshen up. His voice sounded steady and casual, but I couldn't shake the odd feeling that beneath his words was something more, something he didn't want or couldn't say. The next morning, I noticed something was truly different with Michael. He acted as though certain things around him had become foreign or puzzling. We were getting ready to go grocery shopping, and when I got into the car, I saw him sitting in the driver's seat, just staring at the steering wheel. His hands lay on his knees, and his eyes looked straight ahead, as if trying to solve some mystery hidden in an ordinary vehicle. When I reminded him about the keys, he just shook his head and gave a small smile, as though acknowledging his own absent-mindedness. But it didn't feel like ordinary forgetfulness. It felt as if he had just realized, for the first time, what the keys were for. In the end, Michael insisted I drive, saying he was still a bit out of it from the trip. I reluctantly agreed, but something inside me whispered that it wasn't just fatigue. When we arrived at the supermarket, I felt even more unsettled. Michael walked between the shelves, looking around as if seeing the products for the first time. His gaze lingered on items that should have been familiar to him, but now appeared strange. He picked up a box of cereal he usually bought every week and examined it, as though trying to remember what to do with it. A wave of unease washed over me, but I tried to stay composed and even decided to test him. Walking over to the produce section, I casually suggested buying asparagus, his favorite asparagus that he'd always hated and jokingly called rabbit food. I paused for a moment, holding my breath, waiting for his reaction. He nodded and agreed, even adding a few warm words about how thoughtful I was. His voice sounded as usual, and his smile appeared as warm and familiar as ever. But beneath this flawless mask, something subtly unnerved me. His agreement to the asparagus felt wrong as a shadow cast on a bright, sunny day. Trying not to betray my discomfort, I focused on packing the groceries and avoided his gaze. But inside, fear grew, thick and cold. I couldn't shake the impression that the man now standing beside me was merely a shell of Michael, hollow and disturbingly unfamiliar. The next day passed with a slight tension in the air, but I tried to ignore the minor inconsistencies. Michael seemed a bit distant, as though he'd just returned from a long journey and needed to reacquaint himself with everyday life. There were several moments when he seemed not fully oriented with familiar things. He fumbled with the coffee machine as if he'd forgotten how to use it, or searched for something in a usual spot where it had never been. When I pointed it out, he just smiled, as though acknowledging his clumsiness, and joked that maybe he was getting old. But by evening, when he smiled that warm smile of his, I'd almost convinced myself that everything was fine. It was probably just the effects of a grueling trip, and in time, things would settle. At least that's what I thought until I got a call from the sheriff. Later, after what I had seen in the morgue, I needed to tell someone. Anyone. Everything was jumbled in my mind. I couldn't believe or accept what was unfolding before my eyes. As soon as I'd rested a bit after a sleepless night, I called Amanda. She picked up, and upon hearing my voice, immediately suggested meeting at a small cafe nearby. I arrived quickly, my mind teeming with questions and fears. Michael wasn't home, and I nearly begged that he wouldn't find out about our meeting. The moment we sat down in the nearly empty cafe, I couldn't hold back and told Amanda about my worries. I started with Michael's return and how his behavior, though not overtly suspicious, kept unsettling me. Amanda listened, a slight, skeptical smile on her face. She thought I was exaggerating, that it was just a result of the stress I'd gone through during his trip. Maybe he just wanted to play a little prank on you, she suggested. But seeing me on the verge of tears, her expression softened. Amanda hugged me, trying to comfort me and promising that everything would be all right. She vowed to help, even offering to come with me to the sheriff if I couldn't find the strength to go alone. I understood that she didn't fully grasp what frightened me so much, but her support in that moment meant the world to me. Returning home after meeting Amanda, I felt a sense of relief. Finally, there was someone who knew my secret, who understood my fears. My friend assured me she wouldn't leave me to face this alone. Her words felt like a promise that we would find a solution together, and now I was waiting, expecting her to call or text. I held on to that expectation, believing she'd come up with something. She'd always been so strong and decisive. But the entire evening and into the next morning, Amanda was silent. Her silence began to weigh on me. I kept myself busy, checking my phone every few minutes, recalling our late-night conversation at the cafe and her promise to help. But from her, nothing. Just a growing chill in my chest, a creeping premonition that something was very wrong. Later, I stepped outside for some fresh air when Mrs. Grayson, my neighbor, approached me. She looked as flustered and excited as she always did when she had some hot news. But this time, her words hit me like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. "Did you hear about your friend, Amanda? They found her body this morning on a nearby street. They're saying it's murder," she whispered, her gaze fixed on me, wary. I froze, paralyzed. My breath caught, and my heart hammered painfully against my ribs. It felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath me, and I nearly collapsed. Mrs. Grayson's words sliced through my mind, making it impossible to comprehend what any of this could mean. Only one thing was clear. Amanda was dead. She was gone. And I knew. I knew it was no coincidence. My thoughts tangled chaotically, but one thought kept surfacing, like an unwelcome realization. Michael. He had been out late the night before, saying he had some things to take care of. I barely paid attention, accustomed to his brief absences, but now, everything looked different. My heart tightened with fear, but I understood I couldn't stay silent any longer. Wasting no time, I dialed the sheriff's number and, steadying my voice, explained the situation, asking for a meeting. He replied in a measured, professional tone, setting a discreet location in the park where we could avoid prying eyes. I quickly devised a plan. I needed to bring something of Michael's to use for a DNA sample. Trying not to raise suspicion, I carefully gathered a few of his belongings that might work for the test. I remembered he'd left his toothbrush on the bathroom counter, and, in the drawer, one of his handkerchiefs he'd recently used. Quickly placing them in a small bag, I tucked it into my purse and headed for the door, saying I needed to pick up a few things at the store. Michael seemed unfazed. He was sitting in the corner of the living room, absorbed in his laptop screen. I left the house, trying not to look in his direction, and only felt my breath ease slightly once I was outside. The sheriff was already waiting for me in the park, leaning casually against a bench but with a serious look in his eyes. As I approached him, my hands clutched nervously at the bag with the collected samples. Handing it to him, I felt a cold sweat run through me. It was as if this step marked a point of no return. "I hope this helps," I whispered, swallowing my fear. The sheriff nodded and replied quietly that he would do everything he could. I didn't know how to explain my fear and suspicions, but deep inside, I already felt that uncovering this case would lead to terrifying discoveries. A few days after our meeting, his deputy came knocking at my door. The man standing there was stocky, but this time his expression held not just concern. He looked grim and confused, as though facing something inevitable. Anxiety filled me even before he began to speak. The deputy started with questions about my recent visit with the sheriff, asking why I'd met with him and what we discussed. He looked at me so intently that I suddenly felt as if he could read every thought, every fear running through me. Panic rose in my mind, but I quickly pulled myself together. Sensing Michael's unseen presence, knowing he might appear at any moment, I forced myself to respond calmly. I lied, saying the sheriff had asked about Amanda since we were close friends and was interested in the details of our last meetings. This time, I felt my hands tremble slightly and hid them behind my back so he wouldn't notice. The deputy nodded, but didn't take his eyes off me. He didn't intend to leave so easily, and I could feel it. A new wave of anxiety rose in my chest, and I carefully asked why he was so interested in that meeting. Then he looked at me with an even heavier gaze and slowly replied that the sheriff was dead. They'd found him outside town in his car, and though the circumstances of his death weren't entirely clear, it looked like an accident. My mind refused to accept what I was hearing, and my breathing became shallow and ragged. It felt as if everything around me had frozen. First Amanda, now the sheriff. My thoughts spun around this strange thread connecting one tragedy to the next. All my suspicions suddenly felt real, and the connection between the deaths more obvious than ever. I stood there in silence, stunned by the realization, as though I had lost the ability to speak. The following morning, gathering my strength, I went to see the doctor who had examined Michael after his return. The clinic greeted me with its usual calm, pale gray walls, sterile lighting, the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Silence reigned, broken only by the muffled conversations of nurses and the occasional squeak of a chair. The doctor welcomed me with a restrained smile, trying to appear professional, but I noticed a slight furrow in his brow as I began asking my questions. He assured me that Michael was in perfect health. I listened to every word, trying to catch even the slightest shift in his tone, but his voice remained steady. Yet some of his words unsettled me. His organs are in excellent condition. It's as if he was never sick. Frankly, it's remarkable. All his results are clear, without any signs of damage. And then, as if offhandedly, he added, "It almost looks as if his organs were transplanted." Those words echoed within me with a chilling impact. A senseless yet unshakable conviction seized me that this wasn't Michael. A coldness gripped my chest while the doctor, as if oblivious, continued talking. though I no longer heard his words. Hastily saying goodbye, I left his office, barely able to feel my legs beneath me. From that moment, I couldn't bring myself to go home. I wandered the city for hours, losing track of time, stopping only briefly to catch my breath. The day was overcast, the sky heavy with clouds, and a light drizzle brushed gently against my skin. My thoughts kept circling back to the doctor's words, as though every part of my mind was anchored to them. As evening approached, I still felt a lingering unease. When I returned to the hospital, passing it on my way home, I noticed unusual activity in the parking lot. Amid the muted evening light, I saw 3 police cars, their flashing blue and red lights piercing the darkness. Among the small crowd, nurses, doctors, and curious passers-by, I caught sight of police officers in dark jackets. They were all standing close together, discussing something in low voices. Something inside compelled me to get closer. My legs carried me toward the hospital parking lot, where the red and blue lights of the police cars flickered on the pavement. There, in a dark puddle on the asphalt, lay a body. It was the doctor who'd looked me in the eye just yesterday and told me about Michael's miraculous physical changes. Now his vacant eyes stared into the void, his arms splayed out to his sides, unnaturally pale. I couldn't get any closer. They held me back. But what I'd seen was enough to ignite a burning dread in my chest. 3 deaths in just a few days, and I was beginning to understand that all of them were tied to a single threat, the one who was pretending to be Michael. When I finally returned home, the feeling of dread only intensified. Everything around me seemed suspicious, even the silent walls of my own house. I quietly opened the door to the living room and froze, seeing Michael with some strange men sitting on the couch. They all looked eerily similar to one another, like copies, not just in appearance, but in their stillness and the identical expressions on their faces. They sat there, staring intently at the blank TV screen, as if seeing something hidden in the darkness. A chill crept over me at this strange sight. Trying to remain unnoticed, I quietly and quickly moved toward the kitchen. But I hadn't even taken a step before I heard a synchronized, dull rustling. Their footsteps, heavy and slow, silenced my breath, and I pressed myself against the wall, watching from the corner of my eye. They rose and, in an unnervingly casual manner, began exchanging odd remarks about a great game they had supposedly watched. But the TV had been off the entire time. This dissonance, this sense of inexplicable menace, only amplified my fear. The moment the door closed behind them, I broke from my spot and rushed to the bedroom. I couldn't stay here any longer. Something terrible was happening with Michael. I knew it now for certain, and I knew I couldn't live with it. My Michael, the real Michael, had been gone for a long time, and in his place was something foreign. My heart raced as I hurriedly packed my belongings into a travel bag. I only needed the essentials, I thought, just the bare necessities. The plan was simple yet terrifying. I'd tell Michael I was going to my mother's, but instead, I'd disappear for good. I was nearly done packing when the door suddenly opened. A cold shock of fear ran through me as I saw Michael standing there, watching me. His gaze was piercing, unyielding. He asked where I was going. Words stuck in my throat, and finally, forcing myself to speak, I replied that I was going to my mother's. My fingers trembled, and the sweater I was clutching slipped to the floor. I bent down to pick it up, but before I could, I felt his hands grasp me from behind. His touch was cold and unyielding, his hands gripping me like steel clamps, holding me immobile. He leaned in, his face far too close, and his whispered words in my ear froze me in place. "I need you here. You're mine. And if you're so worried about your mother, we could send her to keep Amanda company." My body went numb, and my heart felt like it was about to burst from my chest. It was a threat he didn't even bother to disguise. There was no longer any doubt. This person, this Michael, was dangerous. The next evening, sitting in the silence of an empty house, I found myself listening for every sound outside, every rustle beyond the window. Michael had warned me again before he left that he expected to see me here when he returned. And mentally, I could already feel the invisible chains tightening around me. His words sounded like a command, and an overwhelming sense of entrapment grew within me, one that seemed impossible to escape. Hours passed, and the air in the house felt thick and oppressive. When there was a knock at the door, I flinched. Cautiously approaching, I peered through the small window. The person at the door was Tom. His appearance was a bit disheveled, carrying the faint smell of alcohol, but his eyes showed genuine concern. I opened the door, and Tom, speaking quietly, almost in a whisper, told me he had seen Michael at a bar. He'd been sitting there for hours, looking agitated and on the verge of a conflict with the other patrons. Tom hesitated, unsure whether to ask if everything was all right with Michael, as he'd never seen him like this before. This sudden change in behavior shocked him. Michael never went to bars and had always been quite reserved. Then Tom mentioned he'd seen Michael talking to someone in the bar, a stranger who looked equally unsettling, with a sinister expression, dark clothing, and an intense gaze that made people look away. Tom confessed that his unease had been so strong, even the smell of alcohol couldn't dull the sense of threat. We stood quietly on the doorstep, and I suddenly realized that Michael could return at any moment. I nodded gratefully to Tom, thanked him for the warning, and whispered that I didn't know what was happening either, but didn't want him getting involved. He took the hint, nodded, and said goodbye silently. Before leaving, he promised to stay nearby if I needed help. As the door closed behind him, I stood in the silence, digesting what I had heard. Michael was no longer himself. With each passing day, it felt more certain that someone, or something, else was inside his body, controlling him and trying to control me. Michael returned home late that evening, and I immediately sensed something was wrong. He was entirely sober, but his eyes glowed with a cold anger. His steps were heavy and determined, and his hands, they were covered in something red which dripped down, leaving bloody streaks on the floor. I froze in horror, only imagining what it might be. He cast a glance at me, full of rage and suspicion, as though he saw an enemy in me. Inside, I felt everything clench. The urge to run surged within me, to escape this nightmare and distance myself from this stranger who had once been my beloved. Only one thought flashed in my mind, a way out. Run while there was still a chance. I took a step back, retreating from Michael until I felt the cold metal of the door handle behind me. His face was contorted with fury, every muscle in his jaw tense, his eyes glinting with a wild gleam. He stepped closer, leaning in, and I could feel his hot breath on my skin. "Going somewhere, Jesse?" he whispered, and the sound of it sliced through me like a blade. His voice was both familiar and foreign, his eyes filled with a hatred I'd never seen before. I gathered all the strength I had left, inhaled, and yanked the handle from his grip, stepping back toward the car parked in the driveway. But Michael reacted instantly, like a predator cornering prey. He lunged forward, and before I could reach the car door, his hand seized my wrist, squeezing so tightly it almost knocked the breath out of me. His fingers were like a steel chain digging into my skin, tightening to the point of searing pain that radiated down my arm. I tried to break free, screaming, but he held me with a relentless, terrifying strength. "You're not going anywhere, Jesse. You're mine," he said coldly, smiling like a predator savoring his catch. Then, in that instant, there was a sudden, heavy thud, a blow that reverberated in the night's silence. Michael's grip loosened sharply, his body tensed, his head jerked in front of me, and for a moment, his eyes lost focus. He took a half step forward, as if trying to maintain balance, and then abruptly collapsed, falling like a heavy sack onto the driveway. Stunned, I looked up to see who had stood behind him, holding a raised metal pipe. It was Tom. He stood frozen, trembling, his eyes wide with shock, as if he couldn't believe what he had done. His face was pale, dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights and alcohol. One hand clutched the pipe, now slightly smeared with red, while the other nervously brushed through his hair, damp with tiny droplets, whether from sweat or the recent rain. "Jesse, I saw him kill that guy at the bar. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing to help you," Tom whispered, his breath heavy. His voice trembled, and I sensed not only fear in it, but also shame. A shame born from the fact that his only salvation from that fear had come through a brutal act, one that freed us both from an even greater horror. Wasting no time, I rushed to the car. Tom, glancing around, stepped over Michael's body and slid into the passenger seat, leaving the pipe behind on the driveway, as though the object itself needed to be left behind like an incriminating witness. I started the engine, ignoring all safety precautions, and we sped off, leaving the darkened house far behind. In Tom's house, darkness cloaked every corner, lending each item and each rustle an aura of something forbidden, almost otherworldly. The small room was cluttered with stacks of old newspapers, faded books, and things that looked as though they'd been there for years. The air was heavy, tinged with the stale scent of lingering smoke and alcohol. Only a dim, yellowish light from a lamp above a frayed armchair faintly pushed back the shadows crowding into the corners. I sat across from Tom, staring into his tired, haggard face, illuminated only by that weak light. His eyes, dark and weary, looked at me through a haze of gray stubble, his face marked by a perpetual expression of bewilderment. Tom was a former firefighter, but now, worn down by life, he seemed detached from it all. His rumpled shirt, the dark circles under his eyes, all reflected a relentless struggle he'd been trapped in since losing his job, a pain that had driven him to the bottle. Yet in his eyes, there was a glimmer of hope. He believed that his presence, small and insignificant as it seemed, could help. Sitting on the low stool, I felt my body slowly relax after the night's harrowing events. Something inside me longed for relief, but a bitter thought kept reminding me, this won't last. Isolated from the world in this small room, I felt the wave of despair retreat, making way for a silence that wrapped around me like a fragile shield. I stared down at my hands, noticing small cuts left by the moment I'd tried to free myself from Michael's iron grip. His gaze, that cold, lifeless expression in his eyes, haunted me. I was barely holding myself together, resisting the memory of how he had seemed less like my husband and more like some foreign, dark spirit. Still, uncertainty gnawed at me. Did he truly not know where I was? His cold mind might leave me in peace, or he could already be hunting for me, scouring every hidden corner of our small town. I tried to distract myself, telling myself that I now had a chance to find safety. But this realization was as fleeting as my ability to stay here indefinitely. Deep down, I knew that Michael, however impossible it seemed, wouldn't leave me alone. At last I stood up, gathering all my strength. Tom looked at me carefully, as if reading my thoughts, and nodded in silent agreement. He understood that I needed to go back, to that house, to solve the mystery weighing on me as heavily as Michael's hands had on that fateful night. Tom and I set out together, though the road seemed unusually long and fraught with tension. Everything around us felt strangely silent, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The familiar, ordinary road took on a menacing quality as we neared the house. The small two-story building loomed in the darkness, with no lights visible inside. A wave of fear swept over me, but I focused on my goal, to uncover the truth. Tom and I cautiously approached the front door. I gestured for him to stay back, and then quietly took out my keys and unlocked the door. Inside, there was an absolute stillness, with only distant shadows flickering on the walls. Moving past the living room, I slipped down the hall, my heart pounding furiously. Surprisingly, the bedroom was immaculate, everything neatly arranged, the bed perfectly made. I quickly crossed to his dresser and found his notebook, a thin black journal left carelessly on the surface. I picked it up, feeling a slight tremor in my hands. Flipping through the pages, I noticed how his handwriting changed. It started out neat, then gradually became messy and erratic. Strange symbols and fragmented phrases appeared in the text, like some twisted mixture of cryptic signs and incomprehensible words. The entries began as ordinary notes about his trip to Cambodia, but the further I read, the more disturbing the words on those yellowed pages became. Among the entries was a reference to a place with a strange name, the Valley of Doubles, followed by a description of it. According to ancient beliefs, this place could steal a soul or shadow and replace it with something else, some ancient entity yearning to break into our world. I read these lines, feeling a creeping coldness fill my entire body. He wrote that the place was fraught with danger, that any mistake during the ritual could have horrific consequences, unleashing a soulless darkness that would consume the one who violated sacred rules. I froze, absorbing these words, and then noticed something chilling. Crimson stains marked the edges of the pages. They weren't just stains, but seemed embedded in the very fibers of the paper, like congealed blood soaked into the sheets, stubbornly clinging to the pages. A faint metallic odor, almost preserved within the book, rose as I ran my fingers over the paper, making those blood-red marks look even more sinister. Several pages contained strange notes about people I didn't recognize and even about our home, but the writing seemed distant and eerily foreign. A growing sense of dread filled me, and suddenly, I knew I had to call my mother. I just needed to hear her voice, even though I couldn't admit it to myself. Deep down, I felt an urgent need to confirm she was okay. Tom watched me in silence as I carefully dialed her number. My heart pounded so loudly I thought he might hear it. The anxious rings stretched on, as though waiting for something terrible. I gripped the phone tighter, feeling sweat form on my palms. Finally, I heard her familiar voice. "Sarah? What's wrong, dear?" The relief I felt was immeasurable. It was as if that voice could drive away all the darkness that had settled in my heart. But then I noticed something small, something subtle, like a shadow that crept between us. Her voice was as gentle as always, yet there was a barely detectable hint of coldness, a foreign undertone. My heart clenched, but I forced myself to believe it was only the echo of my own fears. To reassure myself, I decided to ask her a simple question, one we always discussed casually, a question only my mother would know the answer to. "Mom, did you finally replace the bathroom door?" I asked, feigning a light-hearted tone, though inside my whole body tensed in anxious anticipation. "Yes, I did. I have new glass doors now," she replied without hesitation, her answer unnaturally quick. A wave of cold horror washed over me. Glass doors. My mother never had a shower stall. She had always used her old cast-iron bathtub and even laughed off my suggestions to replace it. She used to call that bathtub the only antique worth trusting. I inhaled so deeply it felt like my lungs might burst. That voice, that answer, it was fake, meticulously imitated. But I would have believed it if I hadn't known that small detail. I slowly lowered the phone, each movement echoing the realization that there was no longer any doubt. My mother was gone. The mention of glass doors, the cold voice mimicking her familiar tone, it all confirmed the terrifying truth I had dreaded. Michael had warned me, but I hadn't wanted to believe it, still clinging to the last illusions that something from my old life remained real. I sank onto the bed, and a quiet, hollow sob escaped from deep within my chest. Tears welled up one after another, blurring everything around me, leaving only the raw agony and an unbearable rage. Images of my mother flooded my mind. Her smile, her sighs of exasperation whenever I tried to convince her to update the apartment to replace that old cast-iron tub. She used to laugh, saying it was the only thing she could rely on, and now she was gone. Guilt hung over me like a dark cloud, suffocating every breath. And then there was the rage, a bitter, searing anger that made my hands tremble and fists clench. This thing that had killed my mother, that wore Michael's face, was trying to destroy everything I held dear. I couldn't bear its presence anymore, couldn't allow this monstrous entity to touch what had once been my life. It had to be stopped, torn apart, destroyed. I sprang up from the bed, clutching Michael's journal, and looked at Tom. He understood everything without a word. He must have seen the fire igniting in my eyes. He knew I wouldn't stop, couldn't stop, until this nightmare was over. Together, we hurried out of the house, closing the door as if sealing off the past. Now there was only one path, to confront this demon and end it once and for all. Back at Tom's house, the sense of urgency only grew stronger. I held the journal, feeling its weight in my hands as if it contained not just words, but an unseen darkness that had seeped into our lives, spreading through every corner, threatening our entire reality. Sitting at Tom's old computer, I started searching online for anything that could shed light on the strange notes in the journal. The fog of fear lifted before my determination to find answers, and page after page, I came across obscure articles, mystical legends, and haunting stories that echoed the contents of the journal. But one article, in particular, caught my attention. It was written by a former journalist who, a few years ago, had tried unsuccessfully to bring attention to a place locals considered terrifying. His words had the urgency of someone who had seen something horrific and wanted to warn others. And when I stumbled upon descriptions of events so similar to my own, I knew I had to reach out to him. Within minutes, I found his contact information. My heart pounded as I typed out a message, briefly explaining the situation and hoping he'd respond. He didn't keep me waiting. The journalist was ready to help and willing to listen. As I told him everything that had happened, I felt the weight of fear begin to ease slightly. He listened closely, interrupting only to clarify details. His knowledge was astonishing. He seemed to know exactly what we were dealing with. During our conversation, he told me of an ancient ritual that could banish an entity that masquerades as a loved one. The journalist explained that the ritual required any body of water, an area deep enough to conduct the rite. According to legend, water had a unique property that could bind and trap dark forces that inhabited human forms, turning it into a prison for the unclean spirit. After his explanation, one thought crystallized in my mind. I had to find a way to lure Michael to the lake. This would be more complicated than simply meeting him somewhere. I would have to give him a compelling reason to go, to make him believe I was willing to reconcile, or at least learn the truth. The phone rang sharply, like a crack in the silence. The name on the screen made my blood run cold. I barely glanced at Tom, didn't even register his gaze as I raised the phone to my ear. A chill spread through my body as I heard that familiar voice. Familiar, but devoid of warmth. It was Michael, but at the same time, not him at all. A stranger wearing his face like a mask. He began with threats, his words slicing through me like a blade on thin ice. Each sentence, like a sharpened knife, cut into my consciousness. He promised to destroy everyone I held dear, starting with those I'd already lost. My mother's image flashed before my eyes as his voice assessed my silence, like a predator sizing up its prey. I forced myself to remain calm, though with every word, every sinister tone, my hands trembled more violently. In my mind, the journalist's words echoed like a distant bell. The ritual, the lake, a chance for protection. A plan took shape, no matter how much pain was woven into its creation. The meeting had to take place there, alone, where I could act. The forest cabin, our last shared purchase before his departure, was on the outskirts, surrounded by dense woods, and near it lay a lake, dark, framed by black trees. I ended the call without looking up, as if one more second of listening would shatter me. The cold touch of the notebook's metal spine reminded me of why I was doing this. This notebook wasn't just an object. It was my only chance. A weapon against this predator that wore the face of my loved one. I decided to go alone. Tom insisted that I take him, or at least someone who could help, but I refused. I couldn't risk anyone else's life. I had already lost my mother, and though the grief hadn't fully set in yet, the thought of anyone else being hurt only fueled my anger and resolve. No matter how terrifying this was, I knew that this had to end, here and now. At the edge of the lake stood a small cabin, once cozy but now vacant and ominous. It felt as though the very air was thicker here, heavy with shadows. I moved closer, my gaze drifting over the lake which shimmered under the moonlight. The dark, still surface glinted softly, creating the illusion of depth, as though it could swallow not just the body, but the essence of what stood before me. Time dragged slowly, each minute pulling me deeper into this unsettling world. And then I saw him. Michael, or rather, what pretended to be him, approached through the darkness. From a distance he looked familiar, but the closer he came, the more I noticed something wrong in his movements, in his gaze that radiated a cold fury. Each step he took was weighted, and I felt my heart pound wildly. This Michael looked human, but every detail, from his stride to his hollow eyes, whispered, "This isn't him." I stood on the shore, feeling the cold breath of the lake on my face. My hands trembled, gripping the notebook, the last tether binding this creature to my life. I watched as Michael approached, his form brimming with a chilling cruelty, silhouetted against the dark forest. His gaze was laced with a primal, inhuman rage, and a shiver ran down my spine. I knew I had to lure him into the lake, so I stepped back, holding up the notebook so he could see me hovering it over the water. My intent was clear, and he understood it, but he couldn't help himself. I sensed in his gaze an obsessive need to possess what he believed belonged to him. His fists clenched, and he took a step forward, then another, until he was nearly upon me. Suddenly he lunged, trying to snatch the notebook from my hands. His touch was icy, and I felt his fingers burn me like frostbite. He was unnaturally strong. I couldn't hold my ground and fell to the earth, clutching the notebook so tightly my fingers turned white. He tried to rip it from me, and we grappled, tumbling closer to the water's edge. The lake seemed to be waiting, drawing us toward it with an invisible pull. His hands reached for me again, and I stumbled back in fear, feeling the chill seep into every cell of my body. Rising to my feet, I took a few steps backward, desperate for more time. But Michael lunged at me again, his gaze dark with a terrible purpose. His face appeared to distort, his features stretching, almost twisted, his eyes glowing with a ghostly light. He grabbed me by the shoulders, pinning me down. I felt his cold fingers dig into my skin like iron clamps, his strength seemingly unyielding. His face was so close I could feel his icy breath, and the anger in his eyes shifted to triumph as he leaned in, whispering hateful promises about the loved ones he would kill after me. His words skittered over my skin, leaving trails of dread in their wake. Summoning the last of my strength, I scooped up a handful of wet sand and threw it into his face. He recoiled briefly, and I took the chance to shove him, causing him to stumble back toward the water's edge. My heart raced with a glimmer of triumph. But he lunged at me again, his hands clamping around my wrists so tightly I nearly dropped the notebook. Without wasting a second, I pushed him with all my strength, and this time he fell into the water. His hands still clung to me, pulling me with him, but I managed to break free, leaving him submerged. He began to sink, thrashing in a desperate attempt to escape. His gaze met mine, and there was no human rage left in those eyes, only an inhuman terror, and his face seemed to blur, as if it were losing shape, dissolving in the water. I took a few steps back, watching as he futilely tried to rise to the surface. His hands reached for me, but with each passing second, he sank deeper into the lake, which accepted him like a trap, a cage for dark creatures, just as it was always meant to be. When he finally disappeared beneath the water's surface, silence fell over the lake. I stood there, breathing heavily, feeling the chill from the water seep into my body, but knowing that the nightmare was finally over. The air was heavy, unnaturally still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The lake seemed to have swallowed not just the creature, but also the horror that had haunted me for weeks. I stared at the calm waters, but inside me, a storm was raging. Relief mixed with something darker, a bitterness born of loss and solitude. This Michael had been only a shadow, a distorted reflection of the man I once loved. But even the false semblance forced me to face the reality that he was gone. I understood that after everything, I couldn't return to life as I once knew it. The notebook was still in my hands. I looked down at it, suddenly feeling its weight as if it were laden with an unbearable burden from the past. Each page was stained with memories, promises, and fragments of a life that was no more. Perhaps it was the last remaining connection to Michael. And now, I too had to let go of it. I walked to the water's edge and slowly lowered the notebook onto the lake's surface. It slipped into the water quietly, absorbing the darkness, as though consuming what remained of that sinister force. Watching as the waves cradled it, then swallowed it whole, I finally felt that it was over. It felt like an eternity before I could make myself turn away from the lake. I walked away, leaving this place behind, feeling the emptiness growing inside me. Looking back at the still waters, I realized that now there was only me, the one who survived, but at the cost of unspeakable loss and pain. It was as if something essential had dissolved into the lake's depths, leaving only a hollow void within me. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.